I do want to share two or three things with you, which I think are very important. When AAOIFI was set up in 1990, in the very first few meetings of the Accounting and Auditing Standards, as it was called then, we discussed at length, should we be producing comprehensive set of accounting standards, or should we be focusing on what is really relevant from Sharia point of view? Consensus was, it was not unanimous, but consensus was that we should not try and reinvent the wheel. IFRS already existed as international accounting standards then, and we felt that our role as AAOIFI was to really deal with those specific peculiar transactions that are not normal or typical in these traditional banks and comply with Sharia. And therefore, we decided we should fill that particular gap. And we've done that to a very large extent. But this is a dynamic world. This is a changing world. Things continue to change. The industry has developed. You've heard many times over the last 2 days that we are now over $2 trillion. Changes have taken place in the industry. You've heard a lot about Skooks this morning. We as AAOIFI really need to keep up with it. There are a lot of criticisms and a lot of good things said about AAOIFI. So I wouldn't go into those, but I'll tell you this, that AAOIFI has been trying very hard to work as closely as possible with IASB so that they adopt AAOIFI standards as the relevant standards for Islamic finance. That is an ongoing dialogue. They have held meetings, both in London and in Bahrain, and hopefully we will hear some good news in the weeks to come. So I just wanted to share that with you, that we are aware and recognize that there is a change in the industry, and we are willing and committed to do something about it. The AAOIFI team really absolutely passionate, committed, and have worked extremely hard. I obviously can't vouch for it, but you heard from Dr. Hamid that they were there for Isha, Tahajjud, and Fajr, and that takes some doing. So thank you for that, AAOIFI team, but we would now like to hear from Omar, his presentation. Omar.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. This is a great pleasure for me, and indeed a great responsibility for me, to present before you guys this important strategy at this important stage of life for AAOIFI. Strategy is about past, present, and future. We need to have a quick inventory of our past, whatever we did in past, have to analyze our present performance and our present status, and have to talk about the future. And obviously, then we are going to have suggestions from our distinguished panelists and from the floor on the way that we need to select to go forward. Time limit is limited, so I will try to be as brief as possible. And in certain areas, you might feel that it is not sufficient, but obviously we need to take interest of the overall audience. So we have to be very quick on that. We are just going to discuss about something about the need and the inventory, and then we'll discuss about what we are going to do. Why we are talking about? What is the biggest challenge that we are facing that we are talking about? Obviously, it is 25 years. We need to reevaluate our performance, and we need to reevaluate our future way of action time to time. But right now, we are facing some big challenges. The biggest challenge that right now we are facing is globalization of accounting standards and financial reporting standards. And IFRS except for US, is becoming the only acceptable accounting framework. And even between American standards and IFRS, a convergence project is already going on. So it means that globally, the accounting fraternity, as well as the regulators, stakeholders, they are interested in having a single set of financial statements based on a single set of uniform set of accounting principles. Islamic finance industry, although it has reached a sizable position now, a notable position now, but still it's far below majority, or even I would say it's far below materiality in most of the jurisdictions. So the international standard setters have not been focusing on this as yet, although now they have started at least by setting up a working group and starting working on that. But we were doing something as a service to an industry which was at its nascent stage. It was in infancy. Since last 25 years, we were serving them. And we were serving them in a manner that we were developing the standards that we thought were the most suitable for them. But at the same time, the taste of the pudding is in its eating. You develop standards and nobody adopts them. What is the benefit of having those standards? And why people don't adopt it? You need to evaluate. And what are the pressures that we are having? We need to evaluate. On IFRS, there is a push and pull approach. The push is from the regulators, G20, and other stakeholders who want it to be done this way. And pull side is, I would say, that people think that various countries want investment. They want to attract investments. And a lot of Muslim countries actually need investments. So they are focusing significantly on getting investment, and for that purpose, they need to have an accounting framework which is acceptable to major stakeholders in the world. So you cannot live without IFRS. Now, this is something that is written on the wall. That is one of the most important reasons for us to evaluate our position and to evaluate our future strategy. There are few countries that adopt AAOIFI, very handful of them, 7 or 8 countries. Then we have a few countries, they follow guidelines set up in AAOIFI standards, accounting standards, but they don't adopt them altogether, like Pakistan, Indonesia. And then there are certain countries which are not yet decided fully, but apparently they are going towards IFRS. So this is the high time. Then we need to evaluate, we need to take a stock, we need to discuss whatever we need to do, and we need to set up aggressive targets to achieve those objectives. This is a quick summary of, you can see that since 96 to 2006, 2005, we had a large number of standards developed. After that, the speed has comparatively already slowed down. One reason is that major standards were already covered, but still there was always room for improvement, and there is always room for improvement, and we can see that the standard process has been slow. So now we want to quickly gear up again. Now, there is one important thing. I don't want to go into debate on that. Obviously, that is the most crucial question. Do we actually need Islamic accounting standards? Is there anything that Islam has to do with accounting? Presently, it would not be possible because it would be a subject for an altogether different presentation or discussion forum that whether we need it or not. But the AAOIFI's consensus is that the Sharia compliant or Sharia conscious stakeholders need some accounting and financial reporting information which may be different in terms of disclosures as well as at times in terms of measurement from the conventional users of the financial statements. So accounting itself may be like secular, nothing to do with the religion, but the stakeholders and the users of financial statement who are going to use those financial statement and financial information may have some religious belief, and for that purpose, they need to have the additional or appropriate information in their view. Quickly, why we need our standards to be necessary? Reflection of the true transaction and establishing the difference with conventional, reputation risk, which may ruin the industry. That is, if we do the accounting exactly same as of a conventional institution, there will always be reputation risk to the industry, that there is no difference. And you would have been listening this thing day in and day out, that people say that there is no difference between the two. You have to say that there is difference, and you have to establish that there is difference in substance and form, and that is the reason that you are actually recording these transactions separately and in a different manner. Then correct profit and loss determination from the perspective of the Sharia-conscious users and investors who have invested with you. They need to have the profit that is calculated as per Sharia. Then right sequencing of transactions in line with Sharia and audit trails. That is also important, because lots of Islamic finance transactions are distinct primarily from the documentation and sequencing perspective. So the accounting trail provides the trail for ensuring compliance with Sharia as well. And then determination of right nature of balances for the purpose of relevant information being available for determination of zakat, and determination of transferability and sellability of shares and liquidation of IH, and in identification of impermissible items. So that is the whole idea based on which we conclude again and again that our standards or our guidelines in some form are actually something really needed. Quickly, I will go through the points, selling points that we need to, through our standards and through our research and through our materials, we need to sell to the world, outside world. That transaction reality and right sequencing. We want this transaction characterized in this manner because we want the transaction reality, right sequencing, risk profile of our transactions at different stages of transaction are different from the conventional ones. Mostly recognition and derecognition principles for asset and liabilities are those similar to IFRS. So if it becomes an asset as per Sharia, mostly it will become an asset as per IFRS as well. So even within IFRS, you can have better characterization in line with Sharia. Adverse scenarios, most of the Islamic finance transactions in adverse scenario will have a different effect as compared to a conventional transaction. So again, this is the area where you have to sell it, that, okay, our transactions are different because of that. Then these differences are acknowledged by IFSB from the regulatory reporting perspective as well. Now, regulators across the globe, they are accepting the IFSB standards, and those IFSB standards go with the same principles that the risk profiling and risk characteristics of these transactions are different. And obviously now IMF, World Bank are also considering the different risk aspects, and they are doing their original research on the areas of risk profiling of these assets. So these are the selling points that we need to tell to the outside world, that now this is the situation, that we have to characterize these transactions separately. While we don't say that IFRS is not necessary and IFRS cannot be applied to Islamic finance transactions, but right characterization, that is the key. That even if you do it within IFRS, do it with the right characterization. I'm not going to touch very much on the auditing standards. I'm going to just mention a slide here. We have our 5 auditing standards, and all the auditing standards are more or less like similar to conventional auditing standards. The only difference that we have is that we have the Sharia compliance aspect in our auditing standards. Going forward, we are going to transfer most of the Sharia compliance aspect relating things to our governance standards, and we probably do not want to focus significantly on the auditing standards going forward, except for Sharia audit standards, which will be part of our governance projects team. Just going through a quick overview of the process flow for developing standards. We have been utilizing this reasonably well in the past, but now we are going to make sure that we follow it appropriately. For every standard, we are going to form committee and work groups formation. We may not be having a permanent accounting standards committee going forward, because the new board which is just announced in the press conference is comprising of accounting standard board only. So within accounting standard board, we will be having different committees for different standards rather than having one committee, and it will have better expertise, and it will improve the quality, and it will speed up the things we believe. Committee will be formed, executive team will be formed, mostly things we try to do in-house now, that is a major change. Then we have to do a preliminary study, then consultation notes, where necessary, workshops, and draft standards for the board. At that stage, we approve the draft standard by the board and issue the exposure draft. Then we plan to have public hearings and final standard. This is the process flow which was very much reasonably followed in past, but we now will try to follow it even more appropriately. Quickly update, Mr. Noor Abid has already updated to you on the collaboration with ISB. I just want to add one thing, that after the outreach meeting, they have come up with a working paper on which AOFI has provided its comments. And going forward, there is going to be clear principle that we are going to supplement their research. We are going to help them in whatever things they are doing on the research side and the accounting treatments that we prefer. We'll be recommending to them. We will be part of their working group for sure, inshallah. But we will not right now give up our efforts. We will try our level best to get them convinced on the appropriate treatments that have been defined in our standards. And at the same time, we have decided for sure that we are going to reduce any unnecessary conflicts with IFRS. There are certain standards in which there are certain conflicts with IFRS which were not mandated by Sharia, and rather those were initiated as a part of the standard development process. So going forward, we are going to, inshallah, reduce those issues. New boards, obviously, we are going to have a specialized board on the accounting standards, and this board is going to be working mainly on accounting standards. And the Sharia aspects of the accounting standards will be reviewed by the Sharia board or a committee of the Sharia board formed for this purpose. Now, this is a very important thing on which we have focused on our strategy. We are developing standards, but there are countries who do not adopt it altogether, and there are countries who adopt it, but they do not adopt it directly. Rather, they develop their own standards in this respect. So we have talked to a few of the standard setters and those people who have experience in that, and a few things which are very eye-openers for us. For example, one of the experts said that any company institution need to have one reporting framework. When industry-specific standards are not part of a larger framework of the company would be in dilemma in case of conflict with other standards that generally apply to the company in the jurisdiction. Now, this is a very valid point, we believe. And that is the reason that I mentioned that going forward, we are going to make sure that unnecessary conflicts with IFRS are withdrawn or amended. Similarly, another view is the financial services sector the world over is a highly regulated industry, and therefore, per necessity, each relevant regulator has to take into account governing national statute relevant to that sector. Now, again, this is an important thing that we need to take care of the regulatory requirements of different countries, although we would not be able to take into consideration all of them, but we'll try to set up our standards in a manner that they are neutral and they are not in this region-specific or country-specific. There are certain important points as well. I believe that a few people consider that these are not comprehensive, conflicts with general accounting framework. There is a very important point that major emphasis people feel is on a tax-free environment as of today, because mostly these are applied in GCC region where tax is not the major issue. So there are people who consider that for the tax purposes, certain of the accounting treatments and presentations and disclosure need to be reconsidered. And going forward, inshallah, we are going to make sure that these issues are resolved so that we can have outreach beyond GCC. So quickly, if I summarize, bridging the gaps with the IFRS, convergence with local Islamic finance-related accounting standards, particularly I would say that Pakistan and Indonesia and Saudi, I believe, are our first most important markets whom we are going to start our talks. Already we have started talks, and there is one thing that I can, right now I believe we can announce that we have representatives now on our accounting board, because we have just announced in the press conference. We have representative from our accounting board from these jurisdictions. Inshallah, going forward, it will help a lot. And then global presence, we need to improve our presence on the global footprint has to increase. Improve collaboration with accounting standard setters and regulators across the globe, And thought leadership. Obviously, we need to focus on that, that we need to inculcate genuine research. One of the initiatives, you have already learned about it yesterday, that is going to be our Journal of Islamic Finance Accountancy that we are going to launch. And just before this session, we have, alhamdulillah, signed our sponsorship agreement for that. With regard to IFRS, quickly if we summarize, do we want to go for IFRS or we want to do whatever we are doing? I believe, and we at AAOIFI believe, and we are going to submit our strategy to the first meeting of the new board, that yes, we want to maintain our standards as standards, but avoiding conflict with IFRS wherever possible. There is one issue here which is pertinent to be mentioned, that is the purity issue. Purity issue means that there is some debate going on all the time that your transactions, what you say, you don't do that. So if you say something and you don't do that, then a conventional accountant comes and says, okay, this is similar to conventional loan. Now this purity issue is something crucial, really crucial. And I can just summarize that. I said to my personal opinion, I said to the ISB working group that if you ensure that the entity is AAOIFI Sharia standard compliant, I would suggest that I can convince you in having different accounting treatment. But if that entity is not compliant with regard to Sharia, you cannot convince the accountants that this transaction is different. So this purity issue and the adoption of accounting standards and Sharia standards go side by side. So quickly, change the role, avoid conflict, collaborative role with ISB, IFAC, IFSB, and regulators, and Sharia standards should be our core alongside these standards. If you just go for accounting standard and Sharia compliance is not there, I believe it will defeat the purpose. Future suggestions quickly. We are going to have some research, additional research, accumulating views and perspectives, review of all existing standards. We have started working on that, withdrawal of certain AAOIFI standards. Wherever there is conflict, we may try. For example, in case of consolidation, we may decide to avoid having a separate standard. We may have some guideline with regard to restricted investments, but we are going to maybe, it's just a suggestion. And adoption of ISB framework with necessary adaptations. We have a comprehensive framework of our own. Maybe going forward, we may withdraw that and we may consider adoption of ISB framework with additional guidelines. Adoption of certain ISB standards. We may decide to follow certain IFRS. And issuance of new standards. Obviously, this has to go, and providing some guidance on Islamic accounting in addition to Islamic finance accounting. That is Islamic accounting with regard to zakat and all that. In the research and development, in-house technical function, alhamdulillah, we have established. IFRS review process we have started. We have started a comprehensive research on 100% IFRS review with regard to Sharia and identification of the key differences that may arise. AAOIFI IFRS comparison, we have started another study on this area, and Journal of Islamic Finance Accountancy I've already mentioned to you. The timelines and the targets, we are having very tough targets, inshallah, ahead of us. As you see that yesterday Dr. Hamid was telling you about the fastest pace that we have achieved with regard to Sharia. We want to have it, inshallah, with regard to accounting as well. There is only one area which is going to be having combined effect, that is the Sharia audit you can see here. And otherwise, strategy and 4-year plan, we are finalizing it in December 15. Immediately, we have already started the research and review of a standard process. Group 1 is certain standards which are already in pipeline and a few standards that are identified, including Sukuk in particular, as we have already started, the comprehensive Sukuk project, which includes the Sharia side and the accounting side. And then on the Sharia audit, we have to work together with our governance standards group. And then on Group 2 and Group 3, obviously Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, right now I'm not in a position to put the names in front of you because we are going to discuss a detailed plan with the committee, with the board as soon as the first meeting is there. But we believe that immediately we are going to start work on the Sukuk standard, unrestricted Wakala standard, maybe WAD standard, and we are going to revise already in pipeline Murabha, Ijara. Ijara, we are waiting for ISB to decide to come up with their final standard. After that, immediately after that, inshallah, we'll revise the Ijara standard as well. And our standards for Takaful are already under a revision. So inshallah, this is around a group of 10 standards, out of which 7 will be revisions and 3 will be, inshallah, new standards, which we have a target for 2016 ahead of us. I believe this is end from my side, and I believe I have been on time, 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Invite Dr. Jusuf Wibisana to please share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah, it is an honor for me to give comments on Brother Omar's presentation, but it's really a big challenge for me because Brother Omar has written it thoughtfully and also very well. Nevertheless, I'd like to give a few slides to emphasize important matters that already discussed by Brother Omar. In certain case, also to add a few notes on Brother Omar's presentation. I think the strategy of AAOIFI has been moving to the right direction. The one is separate accounting board from auditing boards and governance boards. By doing so, I think the publication will be more thoroughly discussed and thoughtful. And perhaps the issue of the accountings and auditing and governance also pretty different. So if the separate board established, and then perhaps will enhance the quality of the pronouncements. Maintain and strengthen Islamic accounting standards. There is question from Brother Omar whether we need the Islamic accounting standard, whether accounting standard can be neutral or free from religion, but I believe that Islamic accounting standard is needed as long as we believe that Islamic product is quite unique in comparison to the traditional or conventional products. If you believe that the Islamic products like Murabahah, Mudharabah, Musyarakah, Ijarah is unique, and then perhaps we need Islamic accounting standards. And we need to embed Sharia principle into accounting standards, and I believe that the objective of the Islamic accounting standard actually is in addition to the reporting financial matters for the benefit of the users to improve decision makers, but also to enhance the Sharia compliance. So this one is pretty unique in the Islamic accounting standards, to enhance compliance with the Sharia. That one, I think, is a noble objective of the Sharia accounting standards. AAOIFI's leading role in research as the basis for standards and guidelines. I believe that actually if there is adequate publication and guidelines on the how to deal with the transactions from both sides, not just from the Islamic financial institutions, and then perhaps the acceptance of the standards will be even more. Because at the moment, actually, some people that learn AAOIFI's standards, they sometimes do not understand because there is only limited guidelines. Work closely with Sharia boards and the needs for endorsement from the board for every accounting standards. So in Indonesia, actually every pronouncement will be endorsed by the National Sharia Board. Before endorsement by Sharia National Board, and then the standards cannot be published widely. So once the standard endorsed and got approval from the National Sharia Board, and then that will be mandatory for the Islamic institutions to adopt or to apply that standards. So this will strengthen the Islamic accounting standards if every standards will be endorsed by AAOIFI's standard board or board on Sharia. Again, in general, the presentation by Brother Omar is thoughtful and very well written. In the next slides, I just add a few thoughts on how we need to strategize on the Islamic accounting standard. Finding Islamic paradigms. Conventional financial institutions are structured as financial intermediary, whose activities mainly receiving money, lending money, investing money in financial instruments. Even though we find that some banks actually invest money in real sectors, but most of them actually is only trading on papers and receive money, lending money, investing in financial instruments. If doing so and they do not touch on the real sectors, perhaps is quite risky in the sense that if we trade on papers only, perhaps pretty close, or the risk of falling into riba is pretty high. Islamic financial institutions might not do the same thing with slightly modifying the contract or akad to accommodate the Sharia principles. If we only take the conventional products and then slightly modify and then we say that this one's in accordance with the Sharia principles. Again, even though this is from Sharia is acceptable perhaps, but then because the substance of products actually is just conventional products, and then some people will question whether this one actually is the right one for us. I often hear the comments that the products, namely the Sharia products, actually is just similar to the conventional products, and then why some people should bother to choose among them if in substance actually is similar or quite the same, even though we convince them that actually the Sharia product, of course, there is differences, because in the akad itself, actually, we can find the basic differences. But some people can be convinced and some still unconvinced about the difference. Everyone, I believe, has been aware of the verse in the Al-Baqarah, the ayah 275. If I read that ayah 275 of Al-Baqarah, I often scared because I see how Allah hates so much on the riba eaters, on those who take riba. And then finally saying that ahalallahu al-bay' wa harama riba. Ahalallahu al-bay' wa harama riba. I expect that, and also my colleagues expects that, because that one's very clear, the ayah is very clear, distinction between riba and trading and buy need to be clear, not just skin deep. If distinction of the riba and trading is not clear, then people will find difficulty. How can Allah will bless the trading and hate so much on the riba while the distinction is not clear? So this one is a basic question asked by my colleagues. So if we believe this one, and then the difference between Sharia products or Islamic products need to be clear, not just the difference introduced in the akad or in the wording, verbal wording in the akad, and then we need to think, if this happen, and then of course we will find that the Islamic products or Sharia product is truly different from the conventional products. In this case, we need certainly the accounting standards to cover that ones, the one that not covered in the IFRS, of course. And in Indonesia, there is a strong discussion, intense discussion, whether the Islamic bank only focus on the financial sectors, or should the Islamic banks also embrace in the real sectors. Like a few banks now already apply to the Financial Service Authority to be allowed to do the construction, for example. For Ijaroh, they need to have, for example, high-rise building and then just rent that one for Ijaroh. Or some actually is also interested in buying vessel or ships and then put in Ijaroh, for example. It means that the regulation surrounding Islamic bank will need to be tailored to such matters, because if Islamic bank embrace into real sectors, perhaps again, the current regulation perhaps need to be tailored as such because the capital adequacy ratio and some other regulation perhaps not adequate any longer. Islamic product must strengthen ukhuwah, benefit all transacting parties, and fulfill adalah or justice principles, and syumuliyah or universal. I understand that in Malaysia, for example, many people embrace the Islamic product or Sharia products. But when I ask them why you choose Sharia products while you are not a Muslim, the answer actually, yes, because the Sharia product actually has a benefit of the tax incentive from governments. So if we invest in Sharia products and then our returns will be slightly higher than the conventional products because governments support the Sharia product by introducing tax incentive. Okay. If you accept this, and then Sharia products need to be unique. In some cases, they represent alternative product to the conventional ones. Uniqueness in the Sharia product implies that the substance of the products or transaction differs from conventional ones. Then Islamic accounting standards will be certainly needed. And substance over form actually is the overriding debate or then the debates perhaps never end, this one, and quite intense. Whether the Islamic accounting standards also follow substance over form, or we follow legal forms. As I believe that actually the substance over form is still applicable for the Islamic accounting standards. Because if we do not apply this, and then pretty difficult, because the investors will see the economic reality, not the legal fact on every transaction or reports. Brother Omar mentioned hypocrisy in the contract wording may happen. So it's quite often I saw, because I'm auditors, whether the lawyers put a strong wording. For example, when repurchase agreement or repo, they put that the accounts of financial instruments is transferred to the buyers in a true sales. So they put the words in a true sale. But then in the last of the akad on the contract mentioned that the sellers will repurchase that financial instrument at certain point of time with certain pricing. In this case, even though the wording is true sale, but actually it's not true sales from the substance of a form, because the risk and reward still attached to the sellers. Okay. Fikih maqasid as basis for developing Sharia product may result in Islamic product whose substance is consistent with the form. As I understand, my colleagues mentioned that al-ibratu fil uqudi lil maqasid wal ma'ani walalil al-fadhi wal mabani. So this one actually exactly is like substance over form. To understand a contract or akad, we need to see the intents, management intents of the akad, not just from the wording, how the akad has verbal wordings or the formula. So if we apply this maqasid concept, perhaps pretty easy, quite easier for the Islamic accounting standard to see that the Islamic product actually is unique. In current stage of Sharia business, it is not always easy to apply the principle of substance over form, especially for Islamic products which are developed under fikih ahkam, such as murabah tawaruk, so not always easy. The approach, this the end of my comments. Transaction or product based and not industry based. So at the moment, the AAOIFI's pronouncement actually is on the financial in the financial Islamic financial institutions. So to enhance acceptance, it needs to address from both sides, not just financial institutions, but also from those transacting with financial institutions. So for example, ijarah must be from from lessors and also from lessee. Murabaha need to be from buyers and sellers. Address accounting for all transacting parties, not just for IFIs. Continue to use substance over form. Follow the development of Sharia products. Again, the Islamic accounting standards need to follow the development of Islamic products, because we will report the uniqueness of Islamic products in comparison to the traditional products. So thank you for listening. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Brother Jusuf, for your very interesting comments. I will now invite Shadi to share his thoughts with us.
Okay. Bismillah, salatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I'll try to make it short, as I see Mr. Jusuf took almost same time of Mr. Omar. Now, for the accounting standards strategy, understand it's the strategy for the accounting standards for AAOIFI, not strategy for AAOIFI. Although it's like that, but there is, I'll start by commenting in general for the strategy. There is, the phone maybe, thank you. In general, to have the right and successful strategy, you should make sure that you position yourself clearly and fairly. And if there is weaknesses, clear weaknesses, I hear myself well, maybe definitely. So positioning is the most important thing, and that was clear in Mr. Omar's presentation. He made the right position of AAOIFI. For the past 25 years, first of all, let's congratulate that we, alhamdulillah, achieved that global acknowledge after 25 years. For the past 25 years, AAOIFI is number one in Sharia standards. There is almost, as yesterday the governor of CBB said, there is no other equivalent platform or even close platform like what we have in AAOIFI for Sharia. So alhamdulillah, that's the success, and that's the brand, and that's the equity of AAOIFI. And that's the most important thing, because to be Sharia compliant, you have to make sure that the transaction, muamala itself, followed the right procedure in the Sharia, in the right Sharia way. Accounting comes next. Accounting is not less important than Sharia. However, Sharia standards are more essential, and that made it clear, I think. And AAOIFI was very successful. If we look at the AAOIFI inventory now, in 25 years, we have 26 standards in accounting, 5 in auditing, 7 in governance, and 53 in Sharia, and still developing. And they're moving in Sharia at the same speed that they have to, or maybe faster. However, the problem in the accounting, and that's what the strategy is covering or should cover, is that we are not moving in development, and this is the point when I said positioning ourselves clearly and fairly. We are not moving in AAOIFI at the same speed or required speed as the development and the needs in AAOIFI. That's a very important point I wanted to highlight. Another thing in the strategy in general, we should have a clear direction, so we know where we are, where we stand, what's next, where we want to be. That was not clear in Mr. Omar's presentation, but implicitly was there that we need to promote the level of accounting standards in AAOIFI to the same level of Sharia. And here I'd like to highlight another thing. Is the accounting standards, again, like what I started, but I need to highlight something very important and essential. Is accounting standard, and I think that actually connect both presentations. Is accounting standards same, important? Is it related to religion or not? Accounting is mainly booking, presentation, and measurement. And there is some differences in booking transactions and presentation, but the most important is measurement, and I'll tell why. That's my comment, if I can have some time on that. In the presentation and as I said in the the measurement, yeah, the measurement. the disclosure presentation, all that can, and the proof, the point I'd like to highlight here, the proof that the accounting is less than Sharia, or Sharia is more essential, is that we have many Islamic financial institutions Sharia compliant, but following IFRS. And that's a challenge by itself for AAOIFI to develop and to fulfill the requirements of the stakeholders. Measurement is very important, most important in accounting, and that's why we have to have accounting standards, Sharia compliant accounting standards or Islamic accounting standards under AAOIFI. Simple example is if we look at the basic product for Islamic financial institutions, investments accounts. Investments accounts, if you look at it from presentation perspective, in AAOIFI, it's a separate line between liabilities and the equity because it's considered quasi-equity. In IFRS, it's under liabilities because it's considered financial liability. That does not make that much difference to be in compliance with Sharia. What does make much difference is the assets that the bank or the financial institution linking those investments accounts to the pools that they're defining. And not only that, the accounting treatments for those assets to measure, to recognize the profit that then it will go back to the investments accounts holders and the distribution. So here's the trick. And here's actually the need for the accounting standards, Islamic accounting standards, is the measurement. And that's what we need to focus on. Another point is the AAOIFI versus IFRS. I liked when you mentioned the improvement in the process and the bridging the gaps with IFRS and collaboration. That's a must because that will highlight, or that's actually will shorten the way for AAOIFI and improve the speed as I started with. AAOIFI is not supposed to and should not be a replacement of IFRS. I think that was the old school of AAOIFI. AAOIFI should first take care of the specific Sharia issues and make sure that covered in accounting. Then by that, they get the acceptance and the adoption by AAOIFI. So like in the standard Sukuk, and actually I'm really happy that Sukuk is, we are progressing in Sukuk. Sukuk, this is a unique standard, and this is only belong to this industry. So if we want to help the financial, Islamic financial institutions and the financial Islamic financing industry, like what we have done in AAOIFI for in Sharia, we have to focus on standards that belong to this religion, that belongs to Sharia, to make sure the Sharia, because there is no compromise on Sharia. And here I'd like to refer to the point that thanks to Mr. Yusuf he highlighted. قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في القرآن في سورة البقرة على ما أعتقد ما أذكر سورة الآية 275 الذين يأكلون الربا لا يقومون إلا كما يقوم الذي يتخبطه الشيطان من المس ذلك بأنهم قالوا إنما البيع مثل الربا وأحل الله البيع وحرم الربا. We have to be careful. And in Arabic لازم نكون حريصين ندرك تماما إنه اللي بيقول في شبه بين البيع والربا أو بحكي إنه من سيم هون وقع في إنه من الناس اللي يأكلون الربا والله أعلم فلازم نكون حريصين. This point already addressed by Mr. Yusuf in his presentation, and I'd like to highlight, emphasize, yes, the distinction is there between, and that is really happening and proved in the Sharia standards itself. However, I'd like to just close my comments by saying the Islamic accounting standards should make sure that there is no compromise on the Sharia standards. And that should be clear in our vision to promote AAOIFI standards and not compromise AAOIFI standards with the collaboration with IFRS. We need the collaboration with IFRS. We will have more adoption of AAOIFI, but we have to make sure that this core is maintained. Thank you.
We would welcome questions for the audience. Anybody has questions? Yes, please. Can you get the microphone there?
السلام عليكم. بشار قاسم من أزاد أسد مانجمنت أمريكا. في الحقيقة بالنسبة لموضوع الزكاة أنا من جهة ممارس في مجال الفاينانشال بلاننج والأسيت أدفايزري مع العملاء. في طلب كبير على موضوع الزكاة، وهذه طبعا حقيقة في ثغرة في الاندستري، على الأقل عندنا في أمريكا، إنه معظم الناس اللي بدوروا على حلال برودكت كمان بيبحثوا عن طريقة لحساب الزكاة على أموالهم. والزكاة أقرب هي حقيقة لموضوع الأكاونتنج، يعني بسبب احتياج كثير من المعلومات اللي بتكون على البالانس شيت تبع العميل، فبكون هناك طبعا احتياج كبير في هذا الموضوع. فهناك ما في معيار محاسبي للزكاة محدد، وكذلك وجود أشخاص مؤهلين يعني بيجمعوا بين المحاسبي محاسب قانوني وبنفس الوقت عنده الخلفية في موضوع الزكاة. وأنا في اعتقادي أنه هذا مجال لأيوفي إنها تنشر المعايير المحاسبية بتبنيها لموضوع الزكاة، وحتى كذلك إصدار designation أو يكون جزء من السيبا designation، يكون في تدريب وامتحان في موضوع الزكاة، بحيث أنه يستطيع أن يحسب الزكاة للعميل. وهذه حقيقة يعني حتى إحنا في أمريكا نشجع المحاسبين أنهم يروحوا لأيوفي ويتعلموا، لكن في نفس الوقت يعني بنرشح لهم أنه يروحوا ياخذ كمان designation في السيسا بس لموضوع الزكاة. فهو أولى بالزكاة إنها تكون جزء من المعيار المحاسبي ويحل الإشكالات، لأن هناك كثير من الأمور حقيقة غامضة ما زالت في موضوع الزكاة. فهل أيوفي عندها الخطة على أن يعني تشمل الزكاة كمعيار محاسبي وليس كمعيار شرعي مفصل؟ شكراً.
Thank you for raising a very important issue. Zakah is something that I think raises a whole host of questions for the entire industry. And in fact, last night I was sitting with Dr. here and I was talking about the zakat accounting within Saudi Arabia. Some people put it as expense, some people on balance sheet, so there is no consistency. There is a plan from the office, so I'd like to invite Umar to comment on this.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Number one, right now we do have a standard on zakat, number one. That standard, obviously, like other standards, will be subject to revision. So, inshallah, we will consider your points. But right now, we already have a standard. Number two, you mentioned about that this should be like included in the course for SEPA, I believe. And we, in the revised course that we are going to launch, as we yesterday announced, I can assure you that we have a chapter dedicated to accounting for zakat. Obviously, the third thing you might have seen in my presentation that we said that for the purposes for which we need separate accounting includes determination of zakat. So whenever we develop a standard, we ensure that the amounts that are reflected in the financial statements are either directly calculated for the purpose of zakat, or otherwise the amount that is subject to zakat is disclosed separately. Inshallah, this will be taken care of. Inshallah, it is in revision. Inshallah, we'll take all your consideration. But just for the general audience, we need to tell them that we already have it, and inshallah, we are going to improve it.
The question, I know it's there, but there are a lot of gray areas in the current.
Inshallah, we are going to. Inshallah, we are going to cover.
Okay.
Any other questions? Please.
Umar, if I remember in one of the slides, you said, is there anything Islamic about accounting? Okay. Now, this issue, we have been, as you know, you have been on that committee as well when we were developing in the ICAP, this accounting standard. I always say that accounting is only a mirror reflection of the transaction. If your transaction is Sharia compliant, your accounting will follow accordingly. But if the transaction is not Sharia compliant, no matter what contracts you formulate, what kind of accounting treatment you do, what nomenclatures you use, and how you disclose it is not going to make it any more Sharia compliant than what originally it is. So we need to explain even in our negotiation with IFRS that certain transactions by their inherent nature are a product of Sharia, put it that way. If there is no IFRS on this subject, like Murabha for instance, okay, we have faced with that. In Pakistan, in the ICAP, we chose to formulate an accounting standard, taking guidance from AAOIFI, because Murabha today constitutes something like over 50% of the Islamic bank's financing, over 50%. The remaining about 15 or 20 is Ijara. So it is not a question of is there anything Islamic about accounting. The transactions have to be Sharia compliant, and as very rightly observed by Dr. Jusuf and other commentators as well, that we need to explain the difference between interest and riba. Even today in Pakistan, in our superior courts, despite the landmark judgment, this is being still debated. Is riba the same as interest? We are again back to that Quraysh type when they say riba, the business and lending, riba and profit are the same. We have not advanced in our enlightenment and knowledge. But as Allah said, Ahallal bay'a wa harrama riba. And Allah gives progress and growth to trading, and conversely not to. So we need to explain that a transaction is different. There is no difference in Islamic bank or a conventional to account for depreciation, to account for, to take care of the valuation of inventories. No. Whether it is conventional or Sharia compliant in bank, but there are certain specific products which are Sharia compliant, and they need to have special accounting standards.
Thank you, Mr. Siddharth. That's absolutely right. One gentleman was telling me during lunch that Belgium launched an Islamic product, and on the compliance part, they put this product is Sharia friendly. Well, that's news. It's either compliant or not compliant. I've never heard of such a thing, so it is critical that we explain to the world that it has to be either compliant or not compliant. There is no such thing as Sharia friendly or unfriendly. Sorry, yes, you had a question there?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is with regard to AAOIFI's strategy. By and large, AAOIFI's accounting standards are adopted by regulators for their jurisdiction or by some Islamic financial institutions voluntarily. Is there any provision in your strategy that corporates who are the customers of Islamic banks are going to accept these standards? Why I'm asking that because mostly corporates are reluctant to accept these AAOIFI accounting standards, and they more rely on the IFRS treatment. But when we talk about Islamic finance transactions, so both parties, Islamic banks and corporates, should be adopting the same treatment, as Mr. Ibrahim is saying, that it should be mirroring the real substance of the transaction on the both sides of the transaction.
Your point is well noted. In past, normally our standards were made in a way that they were reflecting only one side of the accounting treatment. But not even this strategy, even before this strategy, I believe this thought process is there. And the draft standard for Murabha, which is under preparation, also includes the other side of the treatment, although it is at a very brief draft stage, but it also already includes. So, but there can be still, so that is for sure that we want to prescribe treatment for both sides, but there will be one issue, whether our standards become legally applicable on those entities or not. But we will prescribe, inshallah, the treatment which is appropriate for both sides, inshallah.
Thank you. We'll take the last question because there is one more session after this, and we would want to invite them soon. So last question, please.
Yes, my name is Muhammad Abu Najah. I want to ask about the digital platform or the recent trends in internet banking. I mean, for example, for us today, most of the transaction we use by our mobile phone. We don't even have contact. And when we see the standards, it's not really reflected there as examples or appendix. For example, I have a credit card from a very well-known Islamic bank in Istanbul, Turkey. And I go to the buyer, I just choose how many installments I want, 9, 3, with the bottom, and then I just come and buy. So, and I pay a markup, 7%. So what is really the contract behind this transaction? I don't even know. If it is assuming it's murabaha contract, okay, where's the separation point between the seller and the purchaser and the order? I'm sure, because the bank has a good reputation, I'm sure it's Sharia compliant, but I'm not aware of. For example, if I'm buying based on wakala on behalf of the bank, I should be aware of this wakala contract. So where in the strategy of the accounting standards could be this internet banking and digital platform trends reflected? If you read the standard about murabaha, the appendix is just giving manual forms and whatever. So how can we reflect this? And this example also raised the question about awareness. When I asked the employee, what is the contract behind this transaction? He didn't even understand what I'm asking about. So for me, it looks like a normal, conventional transaction. It's reflected in the strategy.
Thank you for a very important question, but I believe that question more relates to the next session that relates to governance and ethics. Because we can devise accounting standards for the product that is underlying the transaction. But how it is reflected, it is either on the governance and ethics side, or it goes on the regulatory disclosure side, that if you see the transaction and disclosure standard of IFSB, that already requires this sort of information. So we believe that this is not rightly area that we can do something, because delivery channel, that the delivery channel of the transaction execution is exactly not our accounting area. We have to develop accounting standards for the transaction, and those areas are to be taken care of either by regulatory standards or by governance and ethics standards.
Thank you very much. We would conclude this session. I think the key messages from this session are, first and foremost, that we need to educate everywhere what Sharia is all about. Secondly, the jurisdictions where AAOIFI standards are applied need to increase, and AAOIFI really needs to work very hard on that particular front. I think the third element is to get IASB to recognize that AAOIFI standards are the right ones and appropriate for Islamic financial transactions. And last but not least, a due process, Omar confirmed this in his presentation, would be rigorously followed in what's going to happen, and they need to move a lot faster. Let me thank all of you for being so patient in the afternoon session and for not snoring in the session. Very much appreciated. And let me thank my panelists here. Thank you for a job well done. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. As my worthy predecessor Noor Abid said, that you are all very active and not snoring, and I could confirm that they are all very active. So this being the last session of this very valuable conference, and the topic itself is highly overwhelming, I would say. We had a very nice, incisive discussion in the morning session, whether there should be Sharia compliance that be the parameter of rating or overall governance. I think this particular session this afternoon will perhaps get back to that issue as well. We are very tight on time. Sheikh has to leave by 4:30 or something. And I would rather restrict my initial observations to just laying down the plan for this afternoon session. Khairul Nizam, who is the Deputy Secretary of AAOIFI, he'll be making the presentation for about 10 to 12 minutes. Then I'll be inviting the distinguished panelists. You've got a very distinguished Sheikh Assam and Dr. Usman and Mr. Abdul Bari Michel. They will contribute their experience and their observations on the presentation. We will then invite questions from the floor, and hopefully in about an hour's time, we should be able to call it a day. So I don't want to interfere and be an obstacle between you and Khairu. So Khairu, It's all yours now. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. And very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will probably take around 10 minutes to go through some of the slides to perhaps continue the discussions from the previous session. Just before I start, just let me mention that all the slides throughout this conference will be made available online, and when we do the strategic planning work for AAOIFI standards as well as the overall strategy for AAOIFI operations, we will also be putting some documents online for people to comment. Now, what I will do this afternoon is to just go through some of the slides to perhaps assist the discussions that we will have. Obviously, the strategic thrust of AAOIFI will need to be figured out. In trying to come up with or trying to think of the strategic objectives of AAOIFI, we should bear in mind that AAOIFI, as far as accounting standards go, we have now issued seven governance standards. In addition to AAOIFI governance standards, we also have IFSB guiding principles. And IFSB has issued so far 3 sets of guiding principles. In addition to AAOIFI governance standards, IFSB guiding principles on governance, Islamic banks are also subject to, or Islamic banks can also apply standards and guidelines that have been issued by the likes of BIS, IOSCO, and OECD. So bearing all this in mind, one of the questions that we need to address is what should AAOIFI overall strategic objectives in relation to our governance standards should be. I've listed here some thoughts. A lot of these thoughts are actually from the strategic review that was done by the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, IASB. Obviously, when we want to do our own strategic planning exercise, in assisting our thoughts in planning this strategic planning exercise, we have had a look at what other leading standard setters have done. The IASB, for example, have focused on these 3 areas. They are obviously not really groundbreaking, but I would like to mention and perhaps relate to what Mr. Shadi Zahran mentioned in the previous session, that IAASB, for example, the International Accounting and Auditing Standards Board, their objectives are made within the framework of the International Federation of Accountants framework, being, since IAASB is a unit of IFAC, the strategic objectives of IASB, needless to say, have to fit in within the overall strategic objectives of IFAC. Similarly, in AAOIFI, we have accounting standards, Sharia standards, governance standards. So whatever strategic objectives that the governance standards should focus on, or the strategic objectives that should be designed for the Sharia, for the governance standards, will need to fit into the overall strategic objectives of AAOIFI, and will also need to support the overall objectives of AAOIFI. Obviously, the more important components of that strategic objectives would be the development and revision of standards. We have some thoughts on standards that we should develop, standards that we should review, and so on. We've had a discussion this morning on rating methodology and Sharia rating. So perhaps that is an area that we need to look at quite seriously and consider that. In the last session, there were discussions on ethics. Therefore, business ethics and marketing ethics may be something that we need to consider too. there was a discussion also previously in the previous session on adoption of standards. The adoption of accounting standards, for example, is quite straightforward in that all regulatory authorities have put in a requirement for accounting standards. Most jurisdictions follow IFRS, of course, some jurisdictions follow AAOIFI. For Sharia standards, only a handful of jurisdictions have built in that regulatory requirement to follow Sharia standards. The jurisdictions that have put in such requirement have made it mandatory for Islamic banks to follow AAOIFI, Bahrain, Oman, Pakistan, Sudan, and Syria. Most other jurisdictions have left the matter of adoption of Sharia standards to the bank. Therefore, even in that case, AAOIFI Sharia standards have been extensively followed voluntarily. For governance standards, though, there's a potential model that we are thinking about, that we are considering, or that we're thinking about. The comply or explain model, where institutions are given the choice by an authority to either comply with a set of standards or explain the reasons for their preference in not doing so. The comply and explain model has been adopted especially for governance standards that have been issued, conventional governance standards in some jurisdictions, beyond finance, beyond Islamic finance, of course. So that will be something that we'll need to study more in the course of developing our strategy. Before I finish, Mr. Chairman, let me please conclude that, as Brother Omar mentioned in the session before, we are trying to develop the strategy for AAOIFI. In trying to do that, we will, of course, take stock of all our existing standards, and we will develop the work plan in terms of review and development of certain standards. We'll also need to do a broad strategy, not only for AAOIFI governance standards, but also for AAOIFI as an institution. In doing that, we will need and require assistance from the industry, but more importantly, we will need to consult what the industry expects from AAOIFI and our standards. We'll need to carry out an extensive consultation program, because whatever we decide will need to be what the industry expects us to do, and we'll need to take into consideration the expectation of the industry and the aspiration of the industry. I've reached the end of my presentation. I have actually distributed the slides to the panel members earlier. If the panel members would like to touch, during our discussion, some parts of the slides that I have missed out, please, we can do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Haru. A brief presentation, but a very focused one. I'll now invite our first panelist, Sheikh Hassam, to give his comments and observations, and maybe a few value-added points you might like to add to what has been already said by Haru. Sheikh Hassam.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه والتابعين لهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد. Assalamu alaikum and very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think the very poignant points made by our brother Khairul would be even more accurate and more addressing the practical concerns if we read them in the context of the governance standard which we have, which is governance standard number 6. I urge everyone to read governance standards number 6 in light of the presentation of Brother Khairul. Because in this governance standards, it is spelled out what are we actually measuring, what are we trying to realize, what are the processes, the decisions that come under the scope of this governance when we're talking about governance for an Islamic financial institution. It's given, it goes without saying, that Islamic financial institutions have to fulfill what is expected of conventional institutions regarding accuracy, disclosure, transparency, avoidance of conflicts of interest, etc., in addition to what the principles and the rules of Sharia require and dictate. So let's, in this short time, because I have to make time available and I have to take leave at 4:30. Let me direct the attention of the floor to two very relevant matters that are the basis of governance when we're talking about good or bad governance for Islamic financial institutions, and that is regarding Sharia compliance and regarding enhancing of confidence. As for Sharia compliance, we have inbuilt in the Sharia principles and rules that are, in essence, governance controls. In all financial transactions of all systems and isms, we have to, of course, avoid fraud and deceit and cheating. This is common within all societies and all markets and all jurisdictions. But what is specific to Islam is that we have to avoid riba and gharar. For the fulfillment of the avoidance of riba and gharar, we have a number of detailed control mechanisms given in the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ himself. It's very explicit, for example, in the sayings of the Prophet, you cannot link a sale to another sale. Each sale must be valid and complete in and of itself without being contingent on another sale. Because once you make two sales contingent upon each other, you can very easily circumvent any prohibition. You cannot link a loan with a sale. نهى عن بيعتين في بيع one لا يحل سلف وبيع. What's the point of that? I mean, the loan could be actually completely unlinked to the sale, or the sale could be completely unlinked to the loan. But if it's between the same two parties, this is prohibited. Why? Because it's a very obvious pretext to require to gain consideration or remuneration for the loan through the sale contract. Although they might be in and of themselves completely unlinked and independent of each other. But in order to avoid that, this hadith has come in as a control mechanism. It is to avoid riba. It is not a purely ritualistic prohibition for purposes that we don't understand. No, the purpose is to avoid riba, because all the transactions have to avoid riba and gharar in order to make a Sharia compliant revenue and income. Most of our classical jurists disallowed even the stipulation of one condition outside the term of any sale. Why was that? Because they of course, it's built on a hadith which is a matter of debate between the scholars of hadith regarding authenticity of it. But looking into this hadith as a control mechanism, the issue was it dilutes the transfer of the title. Because Sharia says you can only make income through either a sale or an ijara contract, or whatever comes under the ijara contract, such as wakala or the like. But in the end, you either transferring title of an asset or you're seeking remuneration through a service, either by making that asset available for your use under, of course, defined conditions and terms, or lending your expertise to another party for defined terms and conditions, which is an employment contract, which comes in the Sharia under the leasing and ijara contracts. The point is that they reasoned that if a condition outside the matter of the sale is stipulated in the sale contract, this dilutes the transfer of the title, and therefore the sale is incomplete. And therefore we are not entitled to remuneration. Of course, most contemporary scholars, and I think the Islamic Fiqh Academy allows this based on one of the earlier minority opinions, and of course there is a Sahih hadith in it. But the point is we have to understand what are the principles, that we are fulfilling in our transactions, and how well is the public at large perceiving that this financial institution, this Islamic financial institution, is actually in line with these principles. This probably brings me to the other point, so I've already taken half my time, and that is the perception of independence, which comes under the enhancing of confidence. The perception of independence, of course, usually is focused on that of the Sharia board, which supervises the concerned or relevant IFI. I myself, being a member of a number of Sharia boards, I'm always faced with this query, or with this doubt, or with this concern. And very often, some of my elders in the boards, they rejoinder by saying that whatever remuneration the Sharia board receives should not be a basis for dilution of independence and therefore the confidence, because we have other outside bodies for their services also demanding and receiving remuneration. Your auditors, your lawyers, whatever experts you have on board, even if they're not employed, of course, receive remuneration. But I would humbly submit that this explanation really does not satisfy those who bring about this concern. It does not satisfy them, and therefore it does not put their concern to rest. And I would say that I would urge whoever is amongst us here on the floor, from amongst the central regulators, that there must be a direct intervention by the central regulators to have some sort of a mechanism which regulates this matter in order to give the public at large the confidence they need to perceive the independence of the board, and of course the internal Sharia review departments. The point is that it's not enough to say, no, we trust these sheikhs, we trust these scholars, because doubt can always be raised. Doubt can always be raised, and this is an issue which concerns. We cannot bury our heads in the sand. The only way out of this is to have some sort of mechanism by the central regulators who are recognized, not only perceived, are recognized to be independent by the public at large. And I think I have a number of other points. If we have time, maybe we'll go over them. Of course, good governance requires, in addition to these are just two very basic points addressed, the whole list of points. But when we're talking about IFIs, Islamic financial institutions, we need the necessity of a concern raised by a member of the floor in the earlier session, and that is regarding the explanation behind the products that the IFI is marketing, is presenting. As said earlier, in that specific case where that credit card was dealt with, the relevant member of the staff was completely unaware of whatever concerns. Why should there be any concern? It's a credit card. Khalas, I'm giving you a credit line and you are rewarding me for the credit line. What contract are you talking about? Yani that's the level of, what should I say? Yani that's the level of opaqueness or misunderstanding. I don't want to say ignorance. Yani. Very often, these products are marketed in a completely non-compliant manner. For example, when clients come to the bank and seek financing through tawarruq, I would say in a very large number of cases, sadly, if not in most cases, but to be on the safe side, I would say in a very large number of cases, the staff in charge of this desk explains this product to the client as a loan. We will give you a loan of 1,000 and you return it to us for 1,100. But this is an Islamic loan. It is marketed on that basis. How can that not dilute the confidence in the institution, and I might add, in the industry as a whole? Therefore, the necessity, which alhamdulillah has been adopted in the last few years, in the beginning when Sharia standards were issued, they didn't have the annex at the end which gave the Sharia bases for the various clauses in the Sharia standard. But in line of better governance, alhamdulillah, this has been added. This annex has been added to each Sharia standard, but I believe even that annex has to be expounded a bit more, where the lay reader can connect the dots and can cross the T's and dot the I's. The lay reader, it must be presented in a language that removes confusion for the lay reader. The purpose of the bases, the Sharia bases for that standard is not for Sharia scholars. It is usually for accountants and for lawyers who don't have Sharia training, but I believe they should be even further simplified so that the ordinary lay reader, the ordinary client of the bank can have a better rapport with the line and with the mode. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheikh Assam. Brother Abdul Bari.
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وبعد. الشكر لأيوفي وأمينها العام على تنظيم هذا المؤتمر ودعوتي لأتشرف بالمشاركة وتقديم هذه الورقة بين أيديكم. هذه الورقة تأتي في سياق الرؤية المستقبلية لمعايير الحوكمة المزمع إعادة تطويرها وإصدارها من قبل مجلس الحوكمة والأخلاقيات في أيوفي بالمشاركة مع مجلس المراجعة. فهي سوف تقوم باستعراض التجارب السابقة والموجود لدى أيوفي والرؤية التي سوف أقدمها كإطار مقترح لمنظومة المعايير المستهدف إصدارها من قبل أيوفي. فيما يتعلق المرحلة الأولى أو المبحث الأول أو الجزء الأول من البحث اللي هو استعراض إصدارات مجلس المراجعة والتأكيد الدولي، ممكن اختصار ما صدر دولياً في هذا الإطار بالشكل اللي موجود أمامكم. هذا الشكل. الإصدارات الدولية الصادرة عن مجلس المراجعة والتأكيد الدولي تتمثل في 3 مجموعات: مجموعة قواعد السلوك الأخلاقي للمحاسبين المهنيين، المجموعة الثانية المعايير الدولية للرقابة المهنية، المجموعة الثالثة الإطار الدولي لعمليات التأكيد، ويقع تحت هذا الإطار اللي هو عبارة عن مجموعة مبادئ يقع تحته 3 أنواع من المعايير. المجموعة الأولى المعايير الخاصة بعمليات التدقيق والمراجعة، نتكلم عن التدقيق والمراجعة كمصطلحين مستقلين سوف أتحدث عنهما، والمجموعة الثانية عمليات التأكيد بخلاف التدقيق والمراجعة، والمجموعة الثالثة الخدمات ذات العلاقة. فإذا نتكلم عن قواعد الأخلاقيات، هذا إطار يشمل الكل. نتكلم عن المعايير الدولية للرقابة المهنية والجودة النوعية، ثم نتكلم عن معايير خاصة بأداء العمليات. المعايير الخاصة بأداء العمليات عندنا هذه المجموعات الثلاثة. المجموعة الأولى عمليات التدقيق والمراجعة هي مجموعتين: مجموعة تدقيق ومجموعة مراجعة. مجموعة التدقيق تعطي كلاهما يستهدف إبداء رأي، إبداء منح الثقة للجمهور في عمليات المؤسسة. عمليات التدقيق تعطي تأكيد إيجابي اللي هو يسمى التأكد أو التأكيد المعقول، يعني في رأينا أن البيانات تتمتع بالعدالة. عمليات المراجعة تعطي تأكيد سلبي أنه في رأينا أو لم يصل إلى علمنا أنه ما يخالف ذلك. فعمليات التدقيق والمراجعة كلاهما موجود كخدمة في المعايير الدولية. فيما يتعلق بعمليات التأكيد خلاف عمليات التدقيق والمراجعة تسمى عمليات التأكيد الأخرى. هذه المجموعة معنية بالتدقيق على غير البيانات التاريخية، أما التدقيق والمراجعة خاصة بالبيانات التاريخية، مثل التدقيق على المعلومات المستقبلية، التنبؤ إذا كان بمستوى معين يخضع لعمليات التدقيق، أو تدقيق نظام الرقابة اللي هو معلومات غير مالية. فيما يتعلق بالمجموعة الأخيرة الخدمات ذات العلاقة اللي هي تعرف بأجريد أبون بروسيجر، هذه الخدمات ذات العلاقة هي لا تنتهي بإبداء رأي، لا تنتهي بإبداء رأي، وتعرف في المصطلح تقرير الحقائق المكتشفة، فقط تقديم معلومات، وصاحب القرار ممكن هو بناء على الآراء المقدمة يتخذ رأي. هذه المنظومة الحقيقة هي تطور بشري كبير، وهي الصورة النهائية لمعايير التدقيق أو والتأكيد الصادرة عن مجلس المراجعة والتدقيق الدولي، وبالتالي يجب أن ننظر إليها بعين الاعتبار عندما نريد الانتقال إلى المستقبل. ومن هذا المنطلق نذهب إلى نقطة مهمة سوف نحتفظ بها عندما نتكلم إن شاء الله عن الرؤية المستقبلية، وهو أن المعايير الدولية للتدقيق استحدثت ما يسمى البيانات الدولية لممارسة التدقيق. هذه النقطة في غاية الأهمية، والمعيار اللي مذكور هنا اللي هو ممارسة التدقيق 1000 هو خاص بالاعتبارات الخاصة بتدقيق البيانات المالية، تدقيق الأدوات المالية الصادر في ديسمبر 2011، بمعنى أنه هو يعطي إرشادات للتدقيق على الأدوات المالية في إطار معايير التدقيق والمراجعة. بمعنى أنه هنا نبدأ نفكر أنه في إطار المعايير ممكن نعمل على غرار هذا إرشادات أو جايد لاينز عمليات البنوك الإسلامية مثلا أو غيرها، المهم أو غير يعني مؤسسات أخرى أو أدوات أخرى. أنتهي من هذه النقطة، أنتقل مباشرة للموجود عند أيوفي. هذا ما سبق شرحه أثناء عرض الشكل. الموجود عند أيوفي هذا الشكل يوازي الشكل اللي تحدثنا عنه على المستوى الدولي. عندنا الأخلاقيات، وإن أدرجت بأيوفي بشكل آخر، لكن أنا أعدت تصنيفها لتوازي الشكل اللي معروض سابقاً. الأخلاقيات، ثم بعد ذلك عندنا 3 مجموعات: مجموعة بيانات ومعايير المحاسبة المالية، ومعايير المراجعة المالية، ومعايير الضوابط. هذا مجمل ما صدر عن أيوفي حتى الآن. فيما يتعلق بالأخلاقيات نمر سريعا من خلال الجدول. الأخلاقيات صدر معيارين. فيما يتعلق بمعايير المحاسبة يقصد بها المعايير التي تعتبر توازي معايير المحاسبة الدولية IFRS، فيعتبر هذه معايير المحاسبة الصادرة عن أيوفي هي معايير توازي المعايير المحاسبة الدولية. بالنسبة لمعايير المراجعة الصادرة عن أيوفي توازي معايير التدقيق اللي تحدثنا عنها في الشكل الأول. بالنسبة لمعايير الضوابط هذه يعني هي في المصطلح حسب ما استقرت عليه أيوفي تعتبرها معايير حوكمة، ومعايير الحوكمة أدرجت فيها أيوفي معايير تدقيق شرعي، مثل معيار الرقابة الشرعية اللي هو يخدم عملية التدقيق للهيئة الرقابة الشرعية، ومعيار الرقابة الشرعية الداخلية اللي هو التدقيق الشرعي الداخلي. بينما هناك منظومة معايير أخرى هي ألصق بعملية الحوكمة، مثل والأخلاقيات، استقلالية الهيئة مثلا أخلاقيات، معيار مبادئ الحوكمة حوكمة، معيار تعيين الهيئات فيه حوكمة وفيه تدقيق لأنه تضمن التقرير التي تصدره الهيئة وهو ناتج عملية التدقيق، وتضمن شروط من يشغل الوظيفة. هذا الاستعراض فيما يتعلق بالموجود. سوف أناقش هذا الموجود إن شاء الله في هذا المبحث. نقول فيما يتعلق بمعايير المراجعة والتدقيق هو موضوع اهتمامنا، موضوع معايير المراجعة والتدقيق الصادرة عن أيوفي. وإن كان هذه الجلسة موجهة إلى معايير التدقيق، إلا أنه أنا سوف أسير سريعاً بإبداء وجهة نظر في معايير المراجعة. معايير المراجعة التي صدرت عن أيوفي وإن كان صدرت بحيث تشكل بديل، إلا أنها الحقيقة لم في وضعها الحالي لا تشكل البديل الذي يمكن الاعتماد عليه، لأنها في نقطتين لم تخرج عن المعايير الدولية في مضمونها. النقطة الثانية هي أشارت إلى أنه الامتثال إلى قيد الامتثال لأحكام الشريعة الإسلامية في حال استخدام المعايير الدولية، فهي غير مستقرة على أن تكون بديل، فهي تتيح فرصة الرجوع للمعايير الدولية بشرط عدم مخالفة الشريعة. هذه النقطة الأولى اللي هي عدم كفاية المعايير الحالية لأن تكون يستند إليها في ذاتها. يوجد بعض الملاحظات التفصيلية، عدم التناسق. سوف أذكر مثال واحد فقط لأنه ليس من المطلوب أنه أنا أعرض الملاحظات التفصيلية، لكن سوف أذكر مثال واحد فقط على عدم التناسق. فيما يتعلق بمعيار فحص الالتزام الشرعي للمراجع الخارجي، هذا أحد المعايير التدقيق الصادرة عن أيوفي. ينص هذا المعيار بشكل متناقض مع معيار أهداف المراجعة، ينص على أن من مسؤولية المحاسب القانوني إبداء الرأي في مدى الالتزام الشرعي، ويسير أيضاً إلى خطوة أخرى هذا المعيار ويقول أن المحاسب القانوني مسؤول أن يقدم إقراراً، يعني مستوى أعلى من إبداء الرأي بالتزام المؤسسة بأحكام الشريعة الإسلامية. بينما معيار الأول هدف المراجعة ينص بشكل واضح تماماً أنه ليس من مسؤولية المحاسب القانوني أن يقدم رأياً في مدى الالتزام، وإنما في مدى عدالة البيانات المالية. فهذا الأمر محفز جوهري لإعادة النظر وتقديم رؤية جديدة. فيما يتعلق بهذا الاتجاه طرح بديلان. البديل الأول هو إعادة إصدار المعايير الدولية بالكامل كمجموعة على مستوى الصناعة، بمعنى أنه مثل ما نعيد الآن إصدار معايير المحاسبة، نعمل الآن إعادة إصدار لمعايير التدقيق الدولية، وهذا الأمر يتطلب إعادة إصدار برؤية جديدة، يكون لدى الصناعة منظومة متكاملة من معايير المراجعة. انتهى الوقت. الشيخ عصام، أنت أخذت جزء من وقتي، فما أدري كيف أنا أسترده يعني صراحة. البديل الآخر هو تبني المعايير الدولية للتدقيق بكاملها مع وضع إرشادات لكيفية التعامل معها. المثال اللي أنا ذكرته في هذا الخصوص، إرشادات أو جايدلاينز لكيفية التعامل معها مع المؤسسات والمنتجات المالية الإسلامية، لأنه ما تحتاج إلا إلى رابط كيف تستخدم المعايير الدولية بوضعها الحالي في التدقيق على مؤسسات بعينها، مثل ما جبت المثال اللي هو معيار 1000 في التدقيق على الأدوات المالية. هذا الأمر يبدو حسب ما سمعت أنه في توجه لإقراره، وأنا تقريبا يعني من خلال رؤية أدعم هذا الاتجاه. الأمر الآخر في معايير التدقيق يقول لي بقي دقيقتان، فنستأذن الرئيس بأني أنجز الشكل النهائي من الورقة اللي هو يعتبر الإطار المقترح من وجهة نظري للمنظومة القادمة. هذا فيما يتعلق بالمعايير اللي موجودة استعرضناه، لكن أذهب إلى الرؤية التي أراها إن شاء الله للمنظومة الكاملة. هذا الشكل يستهدف نظرة شاملة لمنظومة المعايير الصادرة عن أيوفي. هذه المنظومة تتكلم عن قواعد السلوك الأخلاقي. آسف لعدم دقة الرسم، لأن الرسم كبير وممكن ما هو واضح، عبارة عن صورة وضع في الباوربوينت. قواعد السلوك الأخلاقي للعاملين في مجال المؤسسات المالية الإسلامية أو التدقيق، فهذه منظومة تحتاج إلى إعادة إصدار من وجهة نظرنا لقواعد السلوك الأخلاقي المعتمدة من مجلس المحاسبين الدولي، مع مراعاة ما صدر عن أيوفي، بحيث يكون لدينا منظومة جديدة للأخلاقيات، لا نترك الذي صدر دولياً، وإذا كان في قيمة مضافة من الذي صدر سابقاً في معايير الأخلاقيات يتم دمجهما وإعادة إصدارهما. يتم إعادة إصدار أو إصدار لأنه لا نملك معيار خاص بذلك، اللي هو المعايير الدولية للرقابة المهنية. نحتاج إلى قسم يتناول المعايير الدولية للرقابة المهنية، وهذا عبارة عن إطار ومبادئ تحكم المعايير التابعة له. أيضاً نحتاج إلى إصدار إطار دولي لعمليات التأكيد الشرعي، ونحتاج أن ننشئ عمليات تأكيد شرعي اسمها تدقيق شرعي كما ذكرنا المنظومة السابقة، ومراجعة شرعية، وعمليات تأكيد أخرى. يعني نريد أن نرى في الصناعة معايير تدقيق شرعي، معايير مراجعة شرعية، ومعايير تأكيد أخرى للمعلومات والبيانات غير التاريخية، كما ذكرنا في المستوى الدولي المعلومات المستقبلية أو نظام الرقابة الداخلية. فنحن نريد أن نرى أيضاً من عمليات التأكيد نوع من التأكيد على تصميم المنتجات، وهذه خدمة موجودة ضمن منظومة التأكيد الدولية تحت مسمى عمليات التأكيد الأخرى. فنحن نريد أن نرى في الصناعة شهادة لنظام الرقابة الداخلية لمنتج معين أو للمؤسسة ككل أنها تملك تمام دقيقة واحدة تملك نظام رقابة مطابق للمعايير واجبة التطبيق. هذه المنظومة يضاف إليها الخدمات الشرعية ذات العلاقة التي تحدثنا عنها هناك، اللي هو agreed upon procedure، اللي هو لا ينتج إبداء رأي، لا يستهدف منح ثقة للجمهور، وإنما ينتج تقريراً بالحقائق المكتشفة. على سبيل المثال أذكر مثال أنه الهيئة الشرعية لا تدقق بنفسها، لأنه من ضمن الأسباب التي تذكر أنه هي غير متفرغة، فممكن تطلب تقرير الحقائق المكتشفة من أي مدقق مختص لا يبدي رأيه، وإنما يقدم الملاحظات الشرعية التفصيلية للهيئة، وهي تستكمل النظر فيها وإبداء الرأي النهائي بشأنها. هذه الخدمة تسد ثغرة في واقعنا الحالي. بالإضافة إلى ذلك عندنا معايير الحوكمة. لو أنا سوف أختم لأنه أشعر بتهديد الآن بضيق الوقت ويقول لي انتهى الوقت، فسوف أخذ راحتي أختم بطريقتي بدون الالتزام بالرسم. لفظ الحوكمة يشمل كل هذا الكلام، لفظ الحوكمة. وأيوفي في طريقتها السابقة جعلت كل شيء تحت الحوكمة، وبالتالي ما ألزمت نفسها بالتصنيف الداخلي للمعايير، فنجد في داخل معايير الحوكمة معيار التدقيق الداخلي، ونجد استقلالية الهيئة تتعلق بالأخلاقيات. فهذه الخلطة أقترح أنا إعادة تصنيفها بهذا الشكل، ونميز بين معايير حوكمة إذا كان العنوان الكبير حوكمة ويندرج تحته أخلاقيات ورقابة مهنية ومعايير التدقيق. نريد إعادة التصنيف أنه معايير الحوكمة تكون خاصة بمن يشغل الوظيفة، مثل هيئة الرقابة الشرعية، إدارة التدقيق، إدارة التدقيق الخارجي، أمانة الهيئة الشرعية، إدارة الالتزام الشرعي، فهؤلاء يندرجوا تحت معايير الحوكمة. لكن كيف تؤدى الوظيفة يكون تحت معايير التأكيد المختلفة، تدقيق ومراجعة وتأكيد أخرى. شكرا لإصغائكم. الورقة موجودة والباوربوينت موجود على الموقع. جزاكم الله خيرا.
Thank you, Dr. Bari. I'll now invite third commentator, Dr. Uthman, and she will give her views on the presentation and also on the subject.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, and good afternoon. Governance is vital, and Sharia governance emerged because of the emergence of Islamic financial institutions. We are talking about the adoption of standards by AAOIFI, and when we talk about adoption of those standards, we invariably have to talk about regulatory authorities and governments, because it is governments of certain jurisdictions which would like to introduce Islamic finance, and it is the regulatory authorities in those jurisdictions which would have to agree and adopt the standards in total. For example, in a few countries, they have said you will have to implement AAOIFI accounting standards so and so, if you're a licensed bank, for example. Or they may incorporate some provisions and clauses from AAOIFI standards into their laws. No matter what, the acceptance and the implementation will have to be preceded by the acceptance and agreement of these regulatory authorities. And so in the last few decades, we have seen many countries reform or modify their legal framework to enable Islamic finance, and also to make sure that there is some form of Sharia governance that is part of the legal framework. Because if these Sharia governance requirements, and they can be complex, are not included in the law, then this means that Islamic banks or takaful companies or Islamic funds will not implement them, and this may lead to an erosion in internal controls, may lead to, God forbid, Sharia non-compliance or other events, and this will lead to problems reputational risks and erosion of confidence in the eyes of the public. Now, if you look at the laws around the world, laws of these countries which have Islamic finance, the extent to which they incorporate Sharia governance into their laws differ. So you can have a country like Malaysia, which after 3 decades of Islamic banking and finance, in 2013, implemented a law that is so comprehensive, is considered the most stringent Islamic finance law in the world right now. It basically legislates the management of Sharia risks. So you have Sharia committees and a whole bunch of laws governing them. You have Sharia risk management required. You have Sharia review, Sharia research, Sharia audit required. Okay? You have that. Or you can have, on the other end of the spectrum, a country like the UK, which basically allows you to set up an Islamic financial institution, but leaves the details basically to you. And I have found that the AAOIFI standards, the governance standards, remains valuable even to a country like Malaysia, because the laws are comprehensive, all sorts of guidelines, but the details as to how you conduct Sharia review and Sharia audit, you can still benefit from the AAOIFI governance standards and AAS 4, for example. If you are in the UK, you are an Islamic bank there, because there are no laws. The FSA will not issue any laws pertaining to Islamic finance. These standards will still apply. And after the GFC, there were a number of jurisdictions which had never considered Islamic finance begin to look at Islamic finance with interest after the global financial crisis. And they said, we want to explore this because even the Vatican liked it. We want to attract Islamic investments, petrodollars. And their central banks immediately initiated moves to modify and reform the legal framework. And what do they look at? Standards. And AAOIFI standards are definitely the ones that they look at. So if we're talking about strategies, then AAOIFI will have to engage with central banks, security commissions, other regulatory authorities, and talk to them about implementations of these standards. They can just take AAOIFI governance number 6, for example, which do not contain detailed rules so much as principles, and this is good enough because you must remember that these countries which have just begun to look at Islamic finance, for example, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Mauritania, these are, for example, they have unique legal frameworks. For example, they are civil law jurisdictions, and there are different types of civil laws, and they will have to reconcile these principles with the features of their legal framework. So they may not have, let's say, a corporate structure using the terms that you find in these standards, but engaging with them and talking to them about their own needs, for example, will actually, I think, lead to a better appreciation of AAOIFI standards. Some of them are very cautious about the content of some of the AAOIFI governance standards because of their own internal problems, and they will say that I do not want to adopt AAOIFI, those governance standards on internal Sharia review, because we don't even know who we are going to appoint as Sharia advisors for our Tajik, Islamic banks. And if we were to put that in place right now, it's going to cause problems. So it is quite possible that an implementation, adaptation of AAOIFI standards to their Islamic banking laws will be a process that will take maybe a decade or more. Malaysia took 30 years, and it continued to take into account AAOIFI and also IFSB standards, culminating in 2013 in a law that they say minimized anomalies between Sharia principles and the common law, which is what our law is based on. And the same, I think, would have to be the process that is adopted by these new jurisdictions to Islamic finance, or these countries which are not so new to Islamic finance but have begun to look at Sharia governance in detail only now. For example, Indonesia, they've had Islamic banks for some years now, but they only started with very rudimentary laws, and they have begun to appreciate the problems that we have seen in the last 2 days when you do not have Sharia governance laws embedded. People, take advantage of the lack of internal controls leading to problems, and they have seen how these issues, when you do not appoint Sharia committee members properly, the conflict of interest issues, there is no Sharia review done. Now they have begun to look at it, and AAOIFI standards continue to be a source of reference. And we must remember that AAOIFI standards continue to be a source of reference, benchmark, and standard for those who are going to one day manage Islamic banks, become Sharia advisors of the future, regulators of the future, and manage standard setting bodies. Students study this all the time. So it is, as one of Khairo's slides talk about thinking how we can revise and what are the areas we need to go into. It would be great, for example, if you want to consider having a specific standard that talks about ESG, for example. Many people ask now, we have ESG, what does AAOIFI say about these things? If all of the criteria for the qualitative and quantitative screening are okay, environmental, are okay, but this corporates, factories in Bangladesh do this. Is this still Sharia compliant? Many people within and outside the Islamic finance industry ask these questions. If you have this, then you will enhance what you have already, actually, governance standard number 7, and make people more aware of the existence of that standard. It is underutilized. Many people are not aware of some of the contents of AAOIFI governance standards, and some new approaches could help in making more people aware of what AAOIFI has been doing all of these years. Thank you.
Well, as you know, we are terribly short of time. The Maghrib prayers have already been announced. I'll leave the floor open for question and answer, and would expect Brother Khairu and 2 distinguished panelists to respond to your questions before I finally wrap up. So please feel free to raise whatever questions you have. Microphone, please.
Assalamu alaikum. By default, I'm a great fan of AAOIFI and very supportive to AAOIFI standards and to promote the Islamic banking regulations, standards in general. The previous session before this one, I was about just to comment that part of what we are doing to promote the AAOIFI standards is that it's not only for our AAOIFI regulated countries that we are imposing the AAOIFI standards. No, we are trying to extend this compulsory adherence to AAOIFI standards to our subsidiaries, to our companies, which are by law is not regulated by AAOIFI or by the central bank. It's governed by the Ministry of Commerce. So that we wanted to be also AAOIFI regulated to support and promote AAOIFI standards and AAOIFI, and to promote the concept, the Islamic finance and Islamic banking concept in general. However, sometimes overdoing things might fire back on the owner of that thing. Now, if we want to make some companies that we own that by law, by its memes and arts, that they have to adhere, they have to utilize the AAOIFI standards with too much governance laws and regulations, that will not make this the preferable choice for these companies, because they would say those governance will cost us. By default, Sharia is a cost center, and you know how business people see and consider this aspect. So yes, we want a better governance, an enhanced governance. We are supportive to this, but I think there should be some sort of consideration: the size of the organizations, the type of that organization, the nature of it, what legal framework it works with. So yes, enhance the governance, but there should, because once you launch those standards as a law, then to make some exclusions, that will not make it professional enough to be absolute and very comprehensive for all the entities that would fall under these frameworks. So this should be considered.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for your support to AAOIFI over the years. The question, I suppose, relates to the investee companies of Islamic financial institutions that are not IFIs themselves. On the accounting side of things, as Brother Omar alluded to in the previous session, some of the standards have been designed in such a way that they are accounting standards for Islamic finance transactions rather than for Islamic financial institutions. Therefore, in terms of accounting standards, yes, some of those standards can give some guidance. But if that investee company is not an Islamic financial institution, therefore it's not required to follow AAOIFI. Well, the key point is, I suppose, they may be required to follow other accounting standards instead. AAOIFI's mandate is, of course, for Islamic financial institutions. I mentioned in my presentations that whatever that we do strategy-wise for accounting standards and governance standards will need to fit into the overall strategy for AAOIFI as an institution, and will need to support that overall strategy. In terms of governance, though, I suppose if some of the standards can be made more principles-based rather than rules-based, then that will potentially, can potentially help even non-Islamic financial institutions, and especially, of course, investee companies of Islamic financial institutions.
Yes, the issue is that once you put it in writing in the MIMS and ART that that company should adhere to AAOIFI standards, the governance standards are part of the AAOIFI standards. So it's included already, it's there. So whatever wording that's going to be or to be in the standards should consider this. This is one thing. Also, even for IFIs, they are different between wholesale, between retail, different of the nature of business. Yes, it's finance and to generate income. However, the nature, the diversity of transactions, the nature of them, the frequency of them is totally different. So as a business needs, it's different by default. So also this should be considered.
Yeah, that's why we mentioned principle-based rather than rules-based, perhaps.
Okay, and then next question, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Muhammad Noor Anwar, Bank Nizwa, Sultanate of Oman. I have two simple questions. The first question is to Brother Khairul Nizam with regards to the governance, as we discussed earlier. Now, the question is that nowadays we know, and especially in this part of the world, there are individual scholars which basically sits more than 20, 30, 40, 50 banks. So what is AAOIFI's standpoint, in view of this particular trend in the market, vis-a-vis the corporate governance? Because perhaps the scholars, we need to protect the institution of scholars from being ridiculed by especially the common market. They have some label to them, for example, scholars for dollars, and it's unhealthy. So scholars for dollars, scholars for fulus. So what is AAOIFI view on this particular issue? One scholar sits more than 30, 40, 50 boards. The second question to the legal expert, to a certain extent, has been explained, the common law or the civil law has been accommodated to Islamic transaction. Yes, it can be confined to a country such as Malaysia or some other countries that have that competent legislation. But when we talk about a cross-border transaction, syndication, whereby the basis is the English law, and to a certain extent, what I've seen so far, based on my humble experience and reviewed, we normally put two clauses. One, to protect the Islamic transaction or Islamic bloc. One, we include the interest waiver clause. And the other point is that within the governing law, we said that the provisioning law is the English law, but subject to Sharia compliance. Is this remains still as an academic or legally tested in the court of law, or is it enforceable, or what's the view on that? Thank you.
If you are talking about a cross-border transaction, and this may involve companies or individuals from different countries, and different laws may be involved, well, the parties will come to an agreement, right, as to what law will govern the contract. And they will also come to an agreement as to which court will have jurisdiction. The legal experts will have, for each side, will have an idea as to what is the attitude of the local law towards Sharia principles. Now, English law treats Sharia principles in a certain way. Every single country treats Sharia principles in its own way. So for example, if I'm in Russia, and Russia would like to implement Islamic banking, right? When I draw up the law there, when I draw up a contract there, the Russian lawyer will have to take into account Russian local law together with Sharia principles, and they will have to be aligned. So these two parties now will come to a negotiation as to which one will benefit them, and usually the one with the higher power will have its say as to, it's what law it prefers will be there. Currently, after looking at some of the cases tried by the English courts, there are some recommendations made by law firms. Number one, to reduce dispute, and reducing uncertainty and dispute is an Islamic law teaching, is a principle of Islamic contract law. So they say, you state from the outset that we both agree that this agreement, this Islamic financing transaction, is Sharia compliant, and we will not raise this issue here onwards. Okay? So that means this will estop them. We call it an estoppel. When they go to a court, an English court in particular, or a Malaysian court, Anglo-Saxon courts, Anglo-Saxon-based law countries will accept this. So you cannot raise this because you have agreed. Yeah? The second principle that lawyers will say is that, especially for the jurisdictions that use as a base English common law, you state exactly what the terms are. The Sharia principle, write it out clearly in the contract. For example, for an ijara, you say that who will bear the maintenance of the asset. So you need not state anywhere when you would like to use the English courts, because we have seen that it is a bit difficult for them to recognize Sharia principles. So the clauses that you have said just now, there are problems if you read the cases. So they say, write out the terms clearly, because what the judge sees on the paper, that is what he will implement. That is a basic English law principle. Now, I'm talking from the perspective of a common law jurisdiction lawyer. When you are talking about this subject to Tajikistan law, subject to Sharia principles, you're going to have to ask a Tajik lawyer what will happen if it ends up in a Tajik court or some other court. So laws is very, very much local. And that is why I said just now, AAOIFI will have to engage with the local authorities for adoption of its principles. Because all laws, unless the authorities, like in Malaysia, the parliament will have to approve the adoption of certain AAOIFI principles, for example. So you need to engage with the authorities in the local jurisdictions. If I missed a part of your question, I apologize.
Thank you. Now we have just time for one last question, if there is any.
Sorry, would you like me to address the issue? Sorry. Yeah, the issue on multiple membership of Sharia board, multiple Sharia board memberships, for example. It is a very sensitive issue, of course. I can give you my personal opinion. It should not be viewed as how many boards a person is in. It should be viewed as whether that person can devote sufficient time in discharging the responsibility. It may well be that even if, for example, a person is on multiple boards, if he can devote enough attention fairly, it may not be a problem. When he was here, made some references to the governance principles and remunerations on one of the standards that we have. We have also issued a standard, governance standards number 5 on independence of Sharia Supervisory Board. In that standard, we have mentioned, we have given some examples of possible issue of independence impairment. And one of the possible issue of independent impairment is long association of Sharia supervisory boards with Islamic financial institutions. And in this standard, what we have said is that an Islamic financial institution should take steps to provide for an orderly rotation of Sharia supervisory boards servicing on the engagement, so as to ensure that at least one Sharia supervisory board should be rotated every 5 years.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to the conclusion of this last session and indeed the conference. For want of time, we had to curtail a few observations and comments by our panelists, for which I apologize. Let me just wrap up by saying that most of the governance issues and principles are common to IFIs and non-IFIs. Okay? And by dint of that, most jurisdictions have some code of corporate governance in place, either as a result of the stock exchange listing regulations or as a part of the law. Therefore, what needs to be done in terms of Sharia governance is something which is of crucial concern as far as AAOIFI is concerned. And it is there where we'll have to focus our attention the most. Because you have heard in the previous session that one common observation which is rather made by those who do not subscribe to the viewpoint of riba being different than interest is what's so special about this Islamic accounting or this Sharia transaction and so on and so forth. We have got to bring home this point that the fact that IFIs have subscribed or dedicated themselves to Islamic form of intermediation, they have to conform to certain basic principles. In Pakistan, I can say that in April this year, our central bank has issued a Sharia governance framework, largely it being based on the AAOIFI principles. Something was mentioned in one of the presentations, probably Haru, you mentioned, with regard to principle and rule-based. I had the honor of doing some work on corporate governance in Pakistan. I can say that in jurisdictions where legal systems are not very established, you per necessity have to observe a rule-based approach rather than principle one. Because sometimes, because of the lack of developed systems, the principle-based code could be circumvented, and which may not be in the interest of the industry. But all I'm trying to emphasize is that most of the principles of corporate governance, which are applicable in non-IFIs, are also applicable to IFIs. And over and above that, IFIs have to be absolutely clear about their Sharia obligations, and by reason of that, by observing all the Sharia dictates with regard to the governance. It's a very comprehensive thing. In the morning session, we're talking about Sharia compliance and Sharia governance. I think governance is something which is the overall umbrella within which even Sharia compliance could be taken care of. So Sharia governance is basically the issue with which we in the AAOIFI are primarily concerned with. I have to thank my last pleasant job being to the presenter Kharu, who has put in a great deal of effort, to the three worthy panelists who have contributed their valuable comments, and to the participants here who have, despite it being the last session, and especially a post-lunch session, you are wide awake and you have been active in the deliberations. So thank you for all that. And I thank AAOIFI and Dr. Hamid for the honor you have done asking me to chair this session. It's been the last session. I don't know how far interest we've been able to generate, but thank you very much nevertheless. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahim, and we are really proud that this session ended by 3 of the new Governance and Ethics Board, Mr. Ibrahim Sadat and Dr. Abdul Bari and Sheikh Isam Ishaq. So finally, I would like to thank all of you for your participation, for your encouragement, for your coming from more than 37 countries. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, this conference attended by more than 520 from more than 37 countries. في الحقيقة في نهاية هذا المؤتمر المبارك لا نملك إلا أن نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يكتب أجركم ويجعل خطواتكم حسنات في موازين حسناتكم وعلى مشاركتكم وتفاعلكم ودعمكم، ونسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى أن ييسر اللقاء بكم إن شاء الله في المؤتمر القادم بعد أشهر قليلة بحول الله سبحانه وتعالى. لعلنا نراكم إن شاء الله بعد قرابة 4 أشهر في شهر مارس بعون الله سبحانه وتعالى. سنعلن بإذن الله عز وجل عن تفاصيل فعاليات أيوفي القادمة ومؤتمراتها بحول الله سبحانه وتعالى. نشكركم مرة أخرى. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك، نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت، نستغفرك ونتوب إليك، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.